Hello, American Prestige listeners. It's Derek, joined as always by my friend and comrade Danny Bessner, and we're very pleased to welcome to the show José Luis Granados Ceja. He is the head of the Latin America desk at DropSite News. He has written a piece for DropSite on the rapidly expanding Hondurasgate scandal, and that's why we've asked him here today. We'll have a link to the piece, of course, in the show description. But Jose, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me. A lot of my friends are big fans of the show. They're going to be thrilled when they hear.
Oh,
See,
a
that's what
lot
we
of
like to hear.
friends. Interesting. I noticed.
Yeah, oh, well,
noticed
yeah,
this
that's
isn't
true.
a
Just
first
a
time,
little
long
omission
time.
there.
Very subtle. Okay.
All right.
No, that's not what I meant at
Fair
all.
enough.
It's just, I think
No,
you may
it's
have
just
name
fair
dropped me, and I actually had a bunch of people write to me. They're like, "Oh, I heard your name drop some."
Oh, hell
on the
yeah.
show."
Yeah,
So that's what
we.
it was.
I mean, we
we-
talked about your piece, I think, in one of our news episodes. So
Yeah, we
Yes,
make
it is.
stars. We mint stars over here
right.
at American
Sure,
Prestige.
that's what we do.
Yeah, but love the work you do. Make sure that's
So, I mean, we have talked a little bit about Hondurasgate on the show, but not in any depth. So why don't we just start with the very basics? What's going on here? What is the scandal? It's based on audio recordings that I think started to emerge last year that seemed to paint a picture of some sort of collaboration between right-wing politicians in Honduras, the U.S. government, the Israelis are involved in, somehow. Maybe we can save that for its own question. To undermine leftist politicians, not just in Honduras, but across Latin America. What flesh that out for me? What's going on here?
Yeah, so the Hondurasgate story, it's one of those stories where you kind of confirm everything you thought was happening. You know, I remember thinking, wow, this is so brazen, this is so cynical. And in fact, that's precisely why we at DropSite decided to do our own investigation. It was just so extraordinary, this complex plot involving Israel and corrupt rabbis, along with this convicted drug trafficker, former President Juan Orlando Hernandez, apparently conspiring with people inside of the Trump administration, with Republicans in the United States, all to weaken the left inside of Honduras, yes, but also I think it's important to say that this is a regional story. It's about Latin America. It's not just about Central America or Honduras in particular. It's about what the United States intends to do and is carrying out very actively to undermine any kind of progressive force in the region. And I think in particular, you know, these are varied kinds of governments from center left to revolutionary radical left that have come and gone throughout the last few decades here in the region. But basically one thing that unites them all is the defense of sovereignty and how much this is a threat to the U.S. agenda in Latin America and how they're pulling out all the stops to be able to impede the advance of that agenda. And obviously, you know, there are other cases. We saw the brazen intervention by Donald Trump in the Argentine legislative elections with this effort to try to tilt the scales in favor of Milei's party. We've seen the open backing of Nasri Asfuda in Honduras. He comes from the National Party, Juan Orlando Hernandez's party as well. But obviously his, you know, really strong support for Noboa in Ecuador and the way that they tried to use Noboa to try to affect the Colombian election. I mean, it's all these kinds of things that are happening. But the interesting thing about Hondurasgate is that we have proof of everything we suspected was going on, about a very, very tangled web at play here. And the part that we found particularly interesting were these comments that he was making. On the one hand, I will say this, you know, this apparently long-term plot that Juan Orlando Hernandez has to come back to power, to use, you know, the influence, the leverage that the United States very much has, especially over smaller countries, smaller economies like Honduras, to make it so that his party comes back into power, as effectively happened. I was on the ground in Honduras for that election. It was pretty extraordinary. It was actually looking like Salvador Nasrallah from the Liberal Party, a center-right party, was going to win. Trump's intervention comes in. I think it very much affected the results. You know, we see the National Party win. So it's on one hand, all with this idea that Juan Orlando Hernandez, who served 2 terms, the second of which was actually unconstitutional, to come back for a 3rd term and preside over a narco regime in Honduras. And, you know, for all the bluster and talk about tackling drug trafficking, what, you know, narco terrorism, as the United States calls it, you know, they're more than happy to work with convicted drug traffickers like Juan Orlando Hernandez and alleged drug traffickers like Daniel Noboa. But of course, the other part is also how they talked about a plot to undermine the left and left-wing governments and left-wing movements in the region, specifically in Colombia, Mexico, and Brazil. And I think that's the part that tells us that, there really is no scruples here. They're going to do everything it takes to make sure that they have not just allies, but lackeys, right? People who are willing to do just anything that the United States asks them to do, and including, these kinds of plots. And I don't think that this is the news outlet that they were talking about in these leaked audio files, but, we saw this report just last week from The Intercept talking about this AI-generated news website, which apparently is linked to the Pentagon. So we know that they understand that information warfare is really important, and this is part of it. And just to conclude on that point on the information warfare, we're seeing it happen in real time when it comes to Cuba. We know that the next target for U.S. imperialism in the region is Cuba, and we see things like Marco Rubio in interviews with NBC News saying, let me talk to the Cuban people directly and deliver information warfare, psychological warfare, trying to talk about, for example, this 100 million in aid that they've apparently offered. And I know that that's warfare, and I know that's not true because we did some reporting on that, where we talked to Claudia de la Cruz. So she's the executive director of Pastors for Peace. They have decades working with Cuba, decades of time working with Cuba, bringing humanitarian aid in, helping out the Cuban people directly. And it was very suspicious to me when they were talking about this 100 million in aid, because actually the United States has already promised a little bit, or I think it was around 10 million after Hurricane Melissa hit Cuba. And of that, only 2.5 million, according to Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs Cosio, has actually been distributed. So you're telling me they're going to be able to distribute magically, quickly, 100 million in aid? It's not true. And that's exactly what Claudia was able to tell us, that without the state, because that's the only condition that Rubio says that they have, right? That the state cannot be involved in distribution of this aid. It's impossible. So it's not true, right? This is just a campaign to undermine support for the Cuban government by saying that they're blocking 100 million in aid, while there is, of course, a very real need on the island. This is U.S. imperialism in 2026, and it's very serious, and it's exactly what they said they would do in their national security strategy. They're pivoting back to the Western Hemisphere, and they're going to do everything it takes to get these lackeys in power.
There's so much there. It's never a good sign when an American official starts talking directly to another country's population. That's never a good sign. But maybe can we talk a little bit about what specifically is in the audio files, and what do they reveal about what's going on here?
So the audio files talk about there's a little over 30 different audio files. And I think it's important to also talk about the authenticity of it, before we kind of get into it, because a lot of people were naturally suspicious because of what they contained, and the fact that they kind of came in this dump. They were first published by this website that was created for its purpose, Hondurasgate, and also Diario Red, which is connected to Pablo Iglesias. It's this media channel that he has. The lead author of that is Valeria Duarte. I want to mention her as well, because she's been doing an incredible amount of work on this, covering this story. And essentially, so these files were made available to the journalists with Diario Red and other who are in Honduras. And they went through the trouble of making sure that they were in AI. They have a whole page where they kind of detail exactly what they were thinking when they first got this file. And they were also naturally suspicious of it as well. And, so they buy this software, Phonexia. And Phonexia, I believe, is a Czech company that basically does that, just checks whether or not it's AI. They bought a end user license for it. There was some controversy around it because this company tried to wash their hands of it, which I find pretty suspicious, to be honest. It's interesting. I suspect, I don't have any evidence to say it, but I suspect that there was some pressure put on them to try to delegitimize these audio files. And then, of course, we over at DropSite, we worked with an NGO called Earshot, which did its own investigation. And the additional thing that we did was actually we sent them known recordings of Nasri Asfura, the sitting president of Honduras, and Juan Orlando Hernandez, the former president, who's at the center of all of this, to see, are these the same voices? And they said with a moderate degree of confidence that indeed these are the same people. So with that, we can say, what do they talk about? They talk about creating a fake news website where they can basically besmirch, they can smear left-wing movements and left-wing governments in the region. They talk about how one of the files that we at DropSite had analyzed in particular, because we didn't do the whole 30, talks about how Juan Orlando Hernandez says, you're in that seat thanks to me. Donald Trump wants this. He wants me. I'm going to be president, right? This talks about this plot for Juan Orlando Hernandez to return to power. That's important because I think maybe people outside of Latin America who are unfamiliar with Honduras don't realize what a horrible character he was. I mean, he was a brutally repressive administrator of the state. He created all kinds of new police forces that have been accused of human rights violations. He opened up the country to foreign investment, of course, more so than it already was. Was one of the driving forces behind these so-called charter cities. They're called sedes in Spanish. He actually jailed many activists, on spurious charges, and of course, was deeply aligned with the U.S. agenda. On top of running for an illegal second term. And so, him coming back to power would be devastating for the Honduran left, for Honduran social movements. He is a figure that is much reviled amongst those circles. There are other elements of the story that I think are important to highlight, especially to a U.S. audience. For example, it's essentially a confession that Trump sold a pardon. There's a whole story behind how Juan Orlando Hernandez actually got pardoned, because it doesn't look like Trump was really kind of passionate about it. And obviously he's kind of flippant in general about these pardons. There was a really kind of scandalous exchange he had with one journalist who asked about one case in particular. And he said he didn't even know who the person was. So, this involves Roger Stone, a man with a very, very long history of corrupt acts as well. So to go back to it, we have a sitting president who essentially, to advance his agenda, working with some likely corrupt actors, reached an agreement to pardon this individual right before the election to try to tilt the scales in his favor, on top of making an open call to the Honduran people to vote for Nasri Asfura, all of that so that he can return to power. And a quid pro quo. It's clearly there. It's interesting that people haven't really kind of taken this on. You would think that you have essentially proof that there was a quid pro quo, that there was an agreement here to sell a pardon, which is legal. It's bribery, right? It's illegal under U.S. law, right? There's criminality at play here. The other element I think is also really important about this story is that, this website that I'm talking about, this news website that they wanted to set up, he apparently got some funding, he says, from support, Juan Orlando Hernandez, from Republicans inside of the United States, but also apparently Malay. So we have a regional kind of story here as well. Javier Milei, the president of Argentina, allegedly financing some of this, and as well as an exchange that he has with what is the equivalent of the vice president of Honduras, where they talk about getting even more money. So they're essentially stealing from the public coffers of Honduras to fund this, which is just, it's insulting on the surface of it. Honduras is a very poor country, and Honduras is a country that has a lot of needs, that has already suffered actually during the Juan Orlando Hernandez government, this draining of the Social Security Fund, to succeed again to advance kind of these political agendas. It's just astounding.
So I before we go into it, I do want to talk a little bit about how do you think the fact that Rubio, and from my understanding, a lot of this South Miami cohort now occupies some central positions in the Trump administration, has shaped all of this, just from a little bit of a macro perspective?
I do think that it's important to remember, right? There is a bipartisan consensus when it comes to U.S. imperialism in Latin America. There's hardly been any difference between Democrats and Republicans. There are degrees of differences in terms of the aggressiveness, obviously. It's indisputable that this Trump administration, particularly the second Trump administration, is far more aggressive about its dealings with the region and really trying to extort and get as much as possible out of the different governments as well. But I would say that, there is something to be said about the influence of these radicals in Florida, and Marco Rubio in particular, and how empowered he has been to drive this agenda as well. He's the one calling the shots when it comes to Latin America policy, and there is kind of competing camps. Certainly in the case of Mexico, for example, he's actually kind of more on the centrist side. There are forces inside of the U.S. The White House, the cabinet, that want to engage in direct military action inside of Mexico. And Rubio is one of the ones that apparently, according to reports, is saying, no, this would ruin the relationship. But when it comes to countries like Venezuela, obviously we know what played out there on January 3rd, the kidnapping of Nicolás Maduro, a radical change in essentially Venezuelan policy since his ouster. There has been a lot of pressure, obviously, applied to Venezuela. And, Venezuela today, in a lot of ways, at least when we're talking about the government, I think the movements and the communards is a different story. It's very much now aligned with U.S. policy and is working very, very closely with the U.S. government on that. And, when we think about Cuba, we can see that Rubio's fingerprints are all over the Cuba policy. There's talk about how the maximum pressure strategy applied in the case of Venezuela during Trump's first term. But here in Trump's second term with Cuba, I don't think we've ever seen just such an aggressive policy when it comes to an attempt to engage in regime change. I mean, this is really, every option available that is within the ability of the executive in the United States to carry out when it comes to trying to create a humanitarian crisis in order to eventually create the conditions for regime change in Cuba is being applied. It's being done in every way possible. I mean, the country is being starved of resources. They are cutting them off from basically every kind of international avenue that is available to them. They were just recently, they lost the ability to even engage in transactions with Visa and MasterCard because the international bank that they were working with will no longer work with them due to the hardened sanctions. And of course, the oil blockade, an illegal blockade. They are preventing countries from sending oil to Cuba. We know that because Mexico wants to send oil to Cuba, and essentially they've been vetoed every time. The language is about, repercussions would be tariffs, but I actually think that my hypothesis is that it's actually a military threat, that if they do this, that they will seize the boat or they'll use as the excuse to attack militarily Mexico. And so this is the Rubio plan. This is what his dreams have always been. And in fact, I mention this anytime it comes up. He talked about it in his writings, about how he used to dream about leading an army of exiles to, quote unquote, liberate Cuba, and that he would install himself as the new president. This is a man who's literally never stepped foot in Cuba. He doesn't know anything about the country. His parents didn't flee during the Cuban Revolution. They fled previously.
It's Batista. Yeah.
Just like Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz famously in that interview with Tucker Carlson confesses, he's like, my father was tortured in Cuba. He was tortured by Batista, but still, you know what I mean? Like, these people drive this narrative. This narrative is really important to them because that's their political base in the region. Like, you have these really extremist views, and I don't mean that just because I'm a left winger anti-imperialist here. I mean, they quite literally have played with terrorism. There was very recently an attack against Cuba. A bunch of people got on a boat with a bunch of bullets and arms to try to invade the country. They were stopped by the Cuban Coast Guard there. But it shows that they're willing to do anything. This is the country that provided the troops for the Bay of Pigs, right? Which was, of course, U.S. backed in a very serious way. So, Rubio is willing to do whatever he thinks it's going to take to oust it, to and including an invasion. I think the Cubans are very much worried about that. They fear that this will eventually culminate in some kind of military action against them, be it a decapitation strike, some kind of or an actual invasion, an attempt to occupy. I mean, it would be a disaster. But just look at Cuba and you can understand what is the U.S. approach to Latin America and who's driving it. It's very much Marco Rubio. Like, Trump isn't a particularly ideological guy, right? Like, he wants to make deals, but he's allowing people like Rubio to set the agenda, and that's where we can see it play out. And we see it in this Hondurasgate story as well. This Hondurasgate story tells us that, that there's no limits to what they're willing to do. They're willing to work with narco traffickers. They're willing to steal from the Honduran people. They're willing to create regional alliances. And I'll finish this intervention on that, right? We should think about things like the Counter Cartel Coalition or the Shield of the Americas. This is supposed to be about combating organized crime groups and drug trafficking in the region, but it's making political statements, right? For example, what's happening right now in Bolivia. There is a very strong militant protest by campesinos and trade unions in Bolivia opposed to President Paz's agenda in that region. It is a perfectly legitimate protest. This is the people rising up to an agenda that's obviously they understand, they know is going to affect their interests. It's going to make life harder for them. And so they're protesting and trying to push the government to walk back this proposal that it's making to really kind of, bring back neoliberalism to Bolivia after the end of the Mas governments there. And they're depicting them as narco-terrorists, as tied to drug trafficking groups, and it's being done in the name of the Shield of the Americas. And so it reveals that really the United States understands that in order to advance this agenda, it's about getting these lackeys into place and also getting them to work in concert with each other to try to marginalize the other remaining countries in the region that do defend this sovereignty. We saw this report from from the New York Times very recently around this deal that they reached with Guatemala. And apparently, according to the two sources that spoke to the Times, it's not even about Guatemala. They just want to sign these agreements with as many countries as possible. Apparently, Honduras is next in order to corner Mexico, in order to get Mexico to accept military action in their territories. And so why? Because they know that this is a way to impede Mexico's defense of sovereignty. That's the key element here. It's one of the things that the sources I talked to for the story we did around Hondurasgate mentioned to us. So the defense of sovereignty impedes the U.S. agenda, and so they're trying to undermine it.
I want to talk a little bit about Honduras specifically and why Honduras winds up at the center of this. There's a temptation, obviously, to make it about the personal affinity between Trump and Hernandez, but there's a history here, right? I mean, go back to the 2000s, the 2009 coup that ousted Manuel Zelaya, and the Obama administration basically just looking the other way because it was convenient. You can go back to the 80s and the Reagan staging aid to the Contras in Nicaragua through Honduras. Much in the same way that we staged aid to elements that would coalesce into the Taliban in Afghanistan through Pakistan. I mean, it was a fertile ground for U.S. imperialism in the region. Is there something about Honduras that makes it kind of gives it this special relationship to U.S. empire, or am I kind of looking for connections where they don't exist?
I think in the case of Honduras, what they did is they took advantage of what they perceived to be a country where the balance of forces were favorable to them. Obviously we had in El Salvador the FMLN, we had in Nicaragua the FSLN, right? We had these really robust, even in Guatemala, robust guerrilla movements, deeply rooted in Marxist guerrilla struggle. In the case of Guatemala, for example, an interesting kind of meld of indigenous people's cosmovision with a materialist analysis, right? And this is in the 20th century where there are national liberation movements that are being successful all over the place. And not to say that there wasn't something like that in Honduras, but they weren't as strong as in other places in Central America. And the way that U.S. strategy has generally worked in Central America and in South America, more broadly, has been to kind of have these strong centers of power where they can project power elsewhere. In the case of the Caribbean, it's Puerto Rico. In the case of South America, it's Colombia. And in the case of Central America, it was Honduras. Certainly during the period of the guerrilla wars, of the internal conflicts that were happening in all of the countries, it was said that it was the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the United States. It was a place where they could stage troops. Presently, it hosts one of the largest U.S. bases, Sotocano, where there are thousands of U.S. troops that are used to precisely that, project U.S. military power in the region. And so I think the particular interest in Honduras has always been that. Also because there were local actors in the case of Juan Orlando Hernandez, but even beforehand, right? You mentioned the coup against Manuel Zelaya. Honduras was largely dominated by two parties, the National Party and the Liberal Party. And Manuel Zelaya came from the Liberal Party. In fact, he was a wealthy rancher, right? He was seen as a member of the ruling elite of Honduras, but he pivoted. There were the conditions in the country, his own personal convictions, the pressure from social movements, from trade unions in that country, made him take a turn to the left. This was also the height of, the 21st century socialism and everything that Hugo Chavez had been inspiring throughout Latin America. And so he aligned himself with that, and they found elites, Micheletti in this particular case, who was willing to lead a coup in that country and understood that they would have the support of the United States. It's interesting because even the OAS condemned that coup, but Hillary Clinton in particular, did what she could to make sure that the coup plotters were able to consolidate power there. So there was always a way for the United States to kind of count on Honduras on being that. And in fact, that's probably why we saw such a brazen intervention ahead of the election there just this past year at the end of the year, because, Libre, the party that was founded as an echo of the resistance against the coup, there was the National Front against the coup that was, composed of very kind of varied forces throughout the country. They make the decision to become a political party. They contest elections. They don't win, but they win with Xiomara Castro in the previous election cycle. And, we're very much a thorn in the side of the United States. And so I think that's probably also why you saw this attempt to make sure that somebody that was willing to work with them was going to be there. And again, just to highlight my response to your question, it's about projecting power. It's about making sure that they are able to have influence throughout the region as much as possible. And in particular, I think one of the things that makes it different from, say, the Biden administration is sort of the abandon of any kind of notion of soft power, right? This idea that you can influence, key actors, or that you can influence civil society. In the case of the Trump administration, it's very much about military might and using that and wielding the threat of military action in order to advance their agenda. I mean, and it's not speculative, right? Like, we've seen it happen. We saw what they did in Venezuela. It was an extraordinary operation, a massive firepower, a huge mobilization of forces. And I think they very much understand that that was also about sending a message to the region, is that if you get out of line, we're willing to do this much, and we have the ability to do it. We have bases everywhere, and if we don't, we'll park an aircraft carrier on your shores and make sure that we can carry it out. That is the logic of the Trump administration.
I'm getting away from something I teased in my first question, which was the involvement of Israel in all of this. Can you talk a little bit about that? Obviously, there are leftist governments in the region who have been, shall we say, hostile to the things that the Israeli government has been doing in Gaza, just in generally to the Palestinians. You can look at Brazil, you can look at Petro's government in Colombia. A lot of rhetoric and severing relations. So it's understandable, I guess, that the Israelis would be keen to undermine these governments. But talk a little bit about what role they're playing in this specific plot.
So, as you well said, Israel understands that it needs to engage in propaganda, it needs to engage in an effort to try to win the hearts and minds of populations. And it's not just West Asia, and it's not just the United States, but the world over. And Latin America is one of those regions where, because of our history, because of how there is support for national liberation movements, it's a place where former guerrilla fighters like Pepe Mujica become president, right? Where there's always kind of been a sympathy for the Palestinian cause, and in particular the resistance, right? There was an embrace of the resistance movements from the PLO, the PFLP, but obviously today, you don't see the kind of condemnation of Hamas and Hezbollah in Lebanon that you see in other parts of the world, certainly like Western Europe and North America, right? That in Latin America, it's understood that, resistance movements rise up in the face of national oppression, and sometimes they're armed. And so, there is a priority for the Zionist movement, for the Zionist entity, to try to shift those tides. I think we also shouldn't go too far into to say that, there was a lot of rhetoric, but there wasn't a lot of action. There was a lot of criticism of Israel. But, for example, here in Mexico, the demand was to break relations with Israel. That didn't happen. There were important advancements, right? For the first time, Palestine was recognized under López Obrador's government. And then Claudio Sheinbaum was the first president to formally accept the credentials of the Palestinian ambassador. So, there is certainly overtures, but I think it didn't quite go as far as it probably should have considering a genocide was being live streamed to the entire world in front of all of our eyes here. But nonetheless, Israel and understands that there is a lot of sympathy for the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause of national liberation. And so then you see also their interest, and that's where I think it lands, is of wanting to shift the discussion when it comes to the opinion of Israel in Latin America, to try to win back support and to try to be able to convince more people, not just at like at the government level or institutional level, but the populations. And I think this is why you see them involved in this. Now, this is one of the trickier allegations that reporters are still investigating. There's somebody working on a story for us right now. Like, who are these rabbis? There's quite literally a quote in there where they say a group of rabbis paid for the pardon. So who are they? What are they linked to? What are their ties to the Israeli government, if any? And all of that is still being unpacked. But if we proceed from the assumption that these allegations that are made in these audio files are true, then we see that yes, that they are mobilizing financial resources to better position themselves in the region by winning the support of individuals like Juan Orlando Hernandez, who's always been close to the Israeli government, as well. Nasri Asfoura one of his first trip before taking office is to Israel. Javier Milei in the region is a huge Zionist, a huge ally of the Netanyahu government in particular, trying to show support. So that it's a priority for Israel, you can see it. And I think it's because of that, because they know that, for as much as they try to wield influence the world over throughout the entire globe, there are pockets where there is clearly sympathy for Palestinians. And that's important, right? It's a, when there are votes at the UN, you know that the Latin America bloc is going to generally support the Palestinian people, although that has obviously changed with some of the more right-wing governments that have come into power now.
That actually leads into, I think, a good question is to talk a little about where the Latin American right is at this point. And I look at Nayib Bukele in El Salvador as he seems to be sort of the model for the new right wing kind of pseudo strongman figure in Latin America, somebody who makes a big show of cracking down on crime and making national security a priority, throws a lot of people in prison, but in the meantime is cutting deals with gangs and doing all sorts of things to kind of fraudulently kind of present this facade, but embraces Trump, embraces that kind of counter narcotics, counter crime rhetoric, if not actually doing anything substantive about the causes of these things. And that seems to be spreading. I mean, Daniel Noboa seems very much cut in that same cloth in Ecuador. I don't know enough about Hernandez or Asfura in Honduras to make that claim. But you've got potentially another figure now emerging in Colombia in that election. Milei strikes me as sort of unique, I guess, or he's just a little kind of a weird guy, but in general. But we had Bolsonaro and maybe now Flavio Bolsonaro in Brazil. Jose Antonio Cast wins in Chile. There is a resurgent right wing, but I wonder what we can say about it in terms of its quality. Is it different to you than kind of right wing governments of the past in the region, or do you see more similarities?
I want to quote Marco Terruggi because he actually made a really good comment in the context of the Peruvian election. We still don't have the results yet as of this recording, but he says the following, and I think it's really quite telling. He says, whatever the outcome in Peru, the truth is that Latin America is so polarized that competitive candidates include figures like De La Spirella of Colombia, a lawyer for paramilitaries, Fujimori, the daughter of a dictator she defends, Cast, a defender of Pinochet, or the chain seal wielding nutcase he was talking about, Milei. Plenty to think about. It is worrisome. The far right has always existed in the region. The far right was in power thanks to military coups. They obviously had the support of the United States throughout much of the 20th century. But it looked like for a while there that the dominant ideology was at least left of center progressive, right? The so-called pink tide. There's been a lot of setbacks for that. And it's one thing to see right-wing candidates emerge. I mean, we talk about Colombia, for example. Uribismo was always seen as kind of like the farthest right ideology on the continent. And it's been displaced by a further right candidate. Uribismo's candidate, Paloma Valencia, who was, former President Álvaro Uribe, who also has allegations of ties to organized crime and paramilitary groups, was openly campaigning for her. And yet, her vote collapsed in an effort to try to stop the left and went to De La Spirella. And this candidate is, he's out of control. He's really quite a radical figure on the right. And yet he has a very competitive election. He could become president. Same with Cast, who is president in Chile, although it looks like he's having trouble actually kind of keeping his government together, his coalition together. He's already very unpopular. But you're right, to add that, Noboa, to Nayib Bukele, Nasri Asfura in Honduras, he's not a radical, he ran a moderate government when he was mayor of the capital, Tegucigalpa. But given the state of things in the region, and in particular the influence of the United States in this moment, it wouldn't be too surprising if he himself makes a hard right turn and aligns himself exactly with the U.S. agenda, which, as we were talking about previously here in this interview, is about a militarized response, about not actually respecting the sovereignty of countries, about setting things up so that the United States and U.S. capital in particular can pilfer these countries to their delight. It's not even as a situation where you have governments that obviously have an inclination towards doing what the United States wants. But no, it's quite literally like throwing the doors open to their country. Do what you want. Exploit our workers. Exploit our resources. Who cares about environmental considerations? Who cares about national development? Who cares about poverty? Like, just do as you like. And I think that's a very worrisome development. I am encouraged by things like Bolivia. Bolivia, the left collapsed essentially in the last election because of infighting. Essentially, there were two camps: the Evo camp and the Lucho Arce camp, and they weren't able to resolve their differences. I'm not an expert on Bolivia, but we all saw the results there. And nonetheless, we see this really valiant resistance right now as we speak. They're in the face of horrible repression, in the face of potentially this declaration of a state of exception, which is like martial law, which essentially would lead to a bloodbath and really quite create a much worse circumstances. They understand the stakes, and there they are doing militant protests. When they talk about doing a strike, they talk about quite literally occupying the highways so that things can't move. It's creating food scarcity in the cities of Bolivia right now because there is no transport. They can't get past these blockades, and every time the armed forces come in and try to clear them, they're either prevented from doing so, or they clear them and they pop right back up a few hours later. So, yes, there is a worrisome trend. This trend, I think, in a lot of ways is due to the failures of the left to really kind of consolidate a new type of regime, a new type of social organization, an over-reliance on winning elections as the only kind of means of testing popular support, of underestimating the role of independent movements to kind of build popular power. But nonetheless, right, like despite the strength of the right in the region, there is still exceptions. I think, for example, obviously Mexico is a huge case. It's the most populous Spanish-speaking country in the world, and certainly in the region, where there is a very strong left-wing party in power that is still advancing in its agenda. Investing everything I basically said about the right-wing agenda to the contrary, right? Investing in social programs, unconditional cash transfers, investing in infrastructure, state-led development, state-led investment. A laundry list of social progress happening in Mexico, poverty being dramatically reduced, all of these things that I think are important. That are happening in a place like Mexico. You have, in the case of Colombia, we still don't know what's going to happen, but there's still a very good possibility that Ivan Cepeda, who comes from a more communist tradition than Gustavo Petro, for example, might become president, right? And that would serve as an important sign of the consolidation of that country's progressive movements and the way that they've kind of learned lessons from the mistakes of understanding what it means to build a coalition that allows you to stay in power and to be able to stave off the right wing, especially in a place like Colombia where the right has always governed except for the arrival of Petro. So obviously there's also the case of Brazil. It's a much larger country. It's much more complex. I think, Lula is facing a tough re-election battle, but, we'll see if he's able to pull through and keep that country in sort of the left's control in the region. And even then, right, like despite the victories, there's still the majority of the peoples in this region are governed by left-wing governments, so it's Brazil, Mexico, and the right-wing governments have had a lot of trouble really administering their governments in the face of resistance, and that's a key thing to remember. And hopefully, that's something that left-wing forces are paying attention to. Is that it isn't just about building political parties that can win elections. It's about making sure that there's an understanding that there has to be, at least in parallel, the building of popular power. Let's take Venezuela for example. Obviously, we've seen setbacks, rollbacks of important legislation, the mining law, the oil law. There's discussion now around the electricity, inviting in private capital. Apparently the U.S. is largely the one that is administering the funds that are generated from the sale of oil. These are extraordinary developments. These are very serious regressions, especially considering all the advancements that were made in Venezuela during, better years. But still, the grassroots Chavistas, they're still building socialism as they understand it, right? The communards are still active building the communal system and building autonomous projects and having self-sufficiency and moving towards food sovereignty. All of the things are still happening because I think in the case of Venezuela, there was far more emphasis on the development of popular power and of their ability to independently wield and affect politics in that country. And that's essentially what's keeping things from going full-blown neoliberalism in the country, right? And that's also why you haven't seen them publicly in any way break with the government to denounce the interim administration for some of the decisions that they've been making. They understand the circumstances are complicated. They understand that they're still being essentially governed at the barrel of a gun, with the United States pointing it at the leadership right now, and that as soon as that they think that Delcy's not playing ball, that they would get rid of her, and still they persevere, they endure. Again, to go back to the case of Bolivia, I think in the case of Colombia, I think the strength of Ivan Cepeda's campaign comes precisely from the way he's been able to animate social movements in that country. His pick of his running mate, Aida Quilque, is a very important figure who is seen as kind of a standard bearer of these social movements. And so, there's a lot of lessons, I think, to be learned from this experience, especially with these right-wing victories, but they're not forever. And I think, essentially there will come a moment where there will be a reckoning because their policies aren't popular. Their policies lead to suffering. In the case of Milei, his support is declining. In the case of Cast, it was virtually evaporated almost overnight. Paz is teetering on the end of his government in Bolivia. So it's difficult. And then, of course, I'll close with this, which is that, I think there's an important factor to take into consideration, which is the U.S. influence. So, the U.S. is clearly sending all the signals through its communications, public, but also private, that they're willing to back these governments to the very bitter end. Some of the reporting from people Ali Vargas, for example, who's very close to Evo's camp in Bolivia, he's been indicating that there is apparently a lot of pressure from the U.S. for them to declare the state of exception. So, if they're saying publicly through the Shield of the Americas coalition, through their statements on, social media that they back the Paz administration, imagine what they're telling them in private. And according to Vargas, there's a lot of pressure happening here. So it shows that they don't really have a consideration in terms of what could be the social impact of some of the support for a repressive policy. And I think that could also produce an important backlash. And with this, it makes me think about Cuba, for example. The situation obviously is dire for the Cuban people, but it's also awoken a sense of solidarity with the Cuban Revolution that I think in a lot of ways had kind of had gone unnoticed or had been weakened over the last few years. Certainly there is now an understanding that Cuba, which has been so generous and so giving to all of the countries of the region, now needs the support of the rest of the region. And you're seeing that. You're seeing Mexico send shipments. You're seeing declarations at high levels to resist the U.S. agenda towards Cuba. I think that kind of thing is important. And if there is an aggression, my suspicion is that if there's an aggression against Cuba, that'll actually wake up a big amount of resistance from the rest of the region to say that this is unacceptable. The kind of thing that we should have seen when they kidnapped Maduro, for example. I think the response was a little bit too muted. I think the response to the extrajudicial executions in the region has been too muted. And I think that might serve as the wake-up call that is badly needed in the region for a regional response to say, this is too far. We cannot tolerate this. I recently did an interview with the former head of the Mexican Senate, Gerardo Fernandez Noroña, and he actually mentioned to us that Maduro, before he was kidnapped, sent him a letter saying essentially that, like, if we don't get our act together, they're going to pick us off one by one. We really need to figure this out. And that's exactly what has happened. And so there has to be that wake up. And if there is an aggression at Cuba, I hope that is the wake up call. I expect it to be the wake up call. And I do think that it would also rattle U.S. Latin American relations because it'll be seen as yet another aggression that cannot be tolerated.
Is there, this is sort of theoretical, but is there a structural problem that the left's facing here? In not everywhere. I'm not talking. I don't want to. I'm not talking about the region as a whole, but in countries like Colombia, El Salvador, places where there's a lot of gang activity, a lot of violence, crime is a major concern for the populace. It's very easy to come in as like a Bukele and say we're just going to throw everybody in jail. We're going to do these very showy things. You get pats on the head from the U.S. You get to demonstrate you're tough on crime. Whereas if you got a government like in Colombia, let's say, like Petro's approach, or even the FARC deal that the Santos government negotiated, these things take a long time to play out. If you're trying to negotiate grievances that armed groups have or deal with underlying causes, poverty, I mean, these are huge things that take a long time. And when you're flip flopping between presidential administrations because people are frustrated because crime's not going down fast enough, you get a situation like, Santos gets followed by Ivan Duque, who just chunks the whole thing out the window. And now you have, FARC factions emerging, having emerged again. You've got instead of that deal serving as a template for agreements with other armed groups, it's just kind of Petro comes back and he's basically starting from zero and gets as far as he can in 4 years. But now with the possibility of a right wing successor, that will go out the window if that's the outcome. Like it feels like there's a structural challenge to overcome here that I'm not sure. I guess how to do it. In a political, I mean, one way, as you said, is to build, get outside the political process, to build capacity, to drive social change. But you still need, at the level of, fighting crime or dealing with crime, you still need the government apparatus to be working in that direction.
Yeah, I think you point to something really important there, which is that in a way, this is a legacy of the very poor bourgeoisie that Latin America has always had, right? It's a bourgeoisie that has always been aligned with foreign capital. It's a bit comprador bourgeoisie is a term that is frequently used to describe them, where they're not really developers of national development. They don't push for any of that. They're happy to live basically off rents. They're happy to live off their relationship with the international bourgeoisie. And so that essentially has created, these conditions of underdevelopment in the entire region. There really isn't a country that was really able to kind of consolidate industrial development to the point to advance to a place where they're, close to these upper income countries like that you see in places like Western Europe and Japan and Australia. And I think it's by design, right? It's to kind of bring in, I know it's out of fashion, but dependency theory, right? Where this idea that Latin America as a country in the global south is not able to develop because precisely it would impede the development of capitalist forces in the north and the accumulation of capital in the north. And so that's why you saw dictatorships. That's why you saw efforts to kind of freeze any kind of industrial development. And the consequences of that are these societies that are incredibly unequal, that obviously generate the conditions where there is a lot of criminality, where there is, there are places where the only choice is either to live dirt poor or to join an organized crime group or a gang or something of the sort. And so I think a lot of that is essentially a question of development. In the place like El Salvador, and I think it's important to notice, right, like, his policies, there are massive human rights violations. There are countless people who have no ties to crime whatsoever, who are rotting in some of these jails right now. But those policies have worked in the sense that the population supports them, right? Like they're like, well, before we couldn't leave our houses because of the fear of gangs, and now we can stroll through the areas that were considered no-go. That's an important thing to take into consideration. I mean, it helps explain why Bukele is as popular as he is, although sometimes it is overstated, right? I think, for example, a friend of mine, she observed the elections there, most recently, Hillary Goodfriend, and she essentially says, Bukele won, of course, right? But his party engaged in fraud to get more seats than they needed in the Congress in order to be able for him to have, the supermajority and continue with his radical agenda. So there's also a lot of, dirty tricks happening as well to consolidate this, despite the fact that he is very popular and that his policies are perceived as working and therefore translating into popularity for him and his parties. And so, it's important to think about, as you said, alternatives. And to that actually brings me to Mexico. So obviously the narrative around Mexico is that it's dominated by crime and that there are parts of the country that are ruled by cartels. That's certainly what the U.S. says all the time. Donald Trump himself says it in those ways. But the policy are working. So And you're right. The reason I think you can start to see it translating into actual successes, and by that I mean less major crimes, like the homicide rate dropping by 45%. This is unprecedented in recent modern Mexican history, is because you had López Obrador serve for 6 years. In Mexico, there's no re-election. Presidents serve 6-year terms. And then Claudia Sheinbaum being elected right after and being able to continue and build upon what he was already able to do. So what was his policy? So it was essentially a rejection of the heavy hand approach of the policy that essentially had been used in Mexico, starting with Felipe Calderón in 2006, continued by Enrique Peña Nieto in 2012, up to 2018 when López Obrador came into power, to say this is the militarized strategy of kind of going after kingpins, of, bringing the army out into the streets. We're not going to do that anymore. The rhetoric that they use is that they stopped engaging in a war. They stopped using that kind of bellicose language, and instead they talk about conquering peace. And so López Obrador, what he did, obviously there's still a role for the armed forces. Some social movements here in the country criticize that he didn't send them back into the barracks, as he said in different occasions, but was obviously one about attending to the social conditions that generate these kinds of criminality, right? To making sure that young people have an option, that they have universities to go to if they want to. They have trade schools to go to if they want to. There's a program called Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro, which essentially the government pays the first year of salary for them to be able to have their first job and be able to start their careers. The scholarships, so that low-income students have the ability to pay for the bus fare and pay for a lunch so that they can actually study. All of these things, they were often criticized because of his campaign slogan, "Hugs, not bullets," saying, oh, they're hugging criminality. It was actually about attending to all these young people, making sure that they have an option. Now, Claudia Sheinbaum comes in, keeps all those social programs, keeps these important scholarships, for example, these job training programs, all of that, but also goes after the money. So has been targeting money laundering, has been targeting sort of key actors that generate the criminality, not necessarily, although on some occasions has, but not necessarily going after the kingpins and kind of fracturing the leadership, although that did happen with the attempt to capture El Mencho, which I think is largely done to appease the United States, which is part of the calculus I think her government and she has had to make to kind of keep them off her back, to keep them from continuing to press for military action inside of the country. But you're seeing it work for once, finally. And the interesting thing is, I think part of, and this is one of the arguments made by a commentator named Billy Rios, is that it's an attempt to basically not have that as a counterexample to Bukele. Right, the Mexico model, not the El Salvador model. And the Mexico model is, yes, social investment, yes, trying to attend to the root causes, but also a different kind of policing. A policing that also is much more targeted. It's much more investigatory. It goes after the money as well. And like I said, the important thing is that it's working. And I know it's hard given the headlines that often come out about Mexico and the rhetoric that especially comes out of the United States. But certainly, there are important advancements, and you can see it in the numbers. Where you see less kidnappings, less homicides. Extortion is one of the ones that has been quite difficult to attend to, and I think that's still one of those quality of life things that hasn't been resolved here in Mexico. But there's a lot of things that are indeed working. People, it's difficult because if you ask people, they still perceive security as their number one concern, and they say it's not getting better. But the numbers don't lie, and things actually are getting better. And I think there's a bit of a catch up that needs to happen in terms of feeling, okay, it is working, right? And then of course, there is a whole, media apparatus which is really driving this point home, because they know that it's one of the weaker points of this government. It's very, very popular. Claudia Sheinbaum has like 70% approval rating. But one of the things that is consistently shown in every single poll is that, the security issue is still stubborn. Same with corruption, right? And they're kind of linked, of course, right? Corruption enables criminality in Mexico. So I do think that emphasizing more the ways that the Mexico strategy is working, I think is really important to undermine those efforts to try to depict Mexico as a failed state, to make it seem like the only option is the heavy hand, the mano dura that you see in places like El Salvador. And of course, places where it's attempted, like Ecuador, where it's clearly not working, which I think is also important to talk about. Noboa is essentially trying to apply the same prescription that Bukele did, and it's not working at all. And I think that's also important to highlight, that aligning yourself with the U.S. military, bombing locations that turn out to be dairy farms, using the armed forces that commit human rights violations, that disappear people like that, all has very negative effects on society, and it doesn't actually fix the problem at all.
So we're getting to an end here, but I want to talk a bit more about the Trump administration approach to Latin America, which obviously has been feathered throughout this conversation. But in particular, a couple of facets. Whether it represents any sort of break with past U.S. policy, it just seems to me to be more naked than past U.S. policy in Latin America, which has also been been geared around pushing U.S. sovereignty at the expense of the sovereignty of the countries in Latin America. It's been geared around the drug war as a means of affecting other U.S. aims in the region. It just seems a little more naked with Trump to me, but maybe you see more of a break with the past. The other thing, in terms of something you said a little bit earlier, is there going to be a wake-up call at some point for the region that says, look at what the U.S. is doing, and we have to stand up against this? The juxtaposition of this faux obsession with narco trafficking, with militarizing the drug war, with just straight up murdering people on boats. I mean, let's be honest; these are extrajudicial executions. They don't, they're not being given due process. They're not even showing any evidence that these people are involved in actual drug trafficking. They're just killing them. Juxtaposed with letting a convicted drug trafficker like Hernandez out of jail, pardoning him, and just some of the absurdities of that. Does that resonate at all in the region?
So I'll put it this way. One of the hypotheses I have is that we could call what the United States is doing a strategic retreat. So it's an effort to try to build back their forces, to make sure that the pieces are in play right now, because they've realized that they're not really in a position to dispute global hegemony anymore. Right? They have a peer rival. Their peer rival is China. China is, in a lot of ways, better positioned than the United States to become, I mean, arguably already is a superpower, but to become the de facto lead state in the world. And because there has been previously an over projection, a emphasis on engaging in armed conflicts. We see the consequences of Trump's decision to attack Iran, for example, of really kind of stretching out their resources, that they have to kind of pull back a bit. And so they're pulling back into what they consider to be their traditional sphere of influence, which is Latin America. And so here in Latin America, they seem to be convinced that they're able to secure the level of support, one that I describe to be domination, right? Like, it's not just about kind of having influence, but actual domination, to be the ones, essentially, as you said in your question, right, to sacrifice the sovereignty of the countries here and by advancing American sovereignty. And so they are putting a lot of emphasis in the region. I mentioned the national security strategy, but also the counterterrorism strategy, which is, even the experts on terrorism have pointed out, that are saying that this essentially is absent any kind of the necessary, steps or measures that to address the threat of terrorism in the way that it actually happens in the world, and using it to once again kind of put this emphasis here and to be able to establish that domination here over the region. And then, but with an eye here to always to kind of position themselves for a future dispute of global hegemony. They haven't abandoned this idea. They're not going to. The policymakers in Washington are very much interested in making sure that the United States continues to be the dominant superpower in the world. And so that's why I think a lot of the danger lies, is that there are the motivation isn't just a more vulgar, that's a term I use, a more vulgar form of imperialism. It's not just that Trump is, capable of saying and doing things that others aren't, although in some ways he is. For example, I don't know if another leader makes the decision to kidnap a president the way that he did in the case of Maduro, right? That his willingness to expend political capital, I think, is important to be able to advance this. But it is with an eye towards making the United States to be better positioned, and to have the resources and the manpower to do it. The U.S. is not going to reindustrialize in the way that I think some people have put forward that is actually the real motivation behind its tariffs. It's not going to actually happen. But they need that industrial capacity, right? They need to be able to create the weapons and create the vehicles and sell, for example, the planes to key makers, to key countries. Like in the case of Peru, it was like a whole scandal around the sale of fighter aircraft to that country because they need to also prop up these arms manufacturers, these weapon manufacturers, these companies of war as well, to make sure that they're able to continually be able to play that role to put the United States in that position. And I think that's really what lies at the heart of all of this. That this is actually the helps us understand why the United States is willing to really kind of engage in radical actions in the region, to do these kinds of campaigns, to openly threaten countries like as they're doing with Cuba, to more quietly threaten countries like Mexico, because they feel like this is necessary for the long-term survival of the United States as the world superpower. And it's an incredibly risky strategy that makes things more dangerous. And I think that's one thing that I think, oddly enough, hasn't been talked about enough, is that it's clearly a more dangerous world now. You think about, for example, the successes of Iran's resistance to the aggression. And it's been because they had a long-term vision in terms of what deterrence actually looks like. And so now you have to consider that countries are now evaluating and probably need to do so more, what deterrence looks like for them. How do you de-link from the United States and your dependence on your commercial relations with them? What does your military strategy look like? Especially when you consider that, there's no country really that can take on the U.S. directly in an armed conflict, but you can dissuade them. You can make the cost of war so high that they consider or reconsider actually engaging in aggression against you. I think about a country like Mexico. Maybe Mexico needs to consider having a stockpile of drones that actually represent a threat to U.S. interests, that actually would make it so that they have to consider what unilateral military action might actually cost. Or, to prepare the citizenry, right here, the Mexican population, for a potential scenario, for example, of cutting off relations with the United States if we are attacked. What does that mean? I mean, it'll be devastating for the Mexican economy. Is the population here in Mexico willing to endure that? It would be a huge blow to the U.S. economy as well. As much as there is an asymmetrical relationship, it's worth remembering that Mexico is the United States' #1 trading partner. And that is, Trump loves to talk about having cards in your hand. Mexico has that card in its hand. It could actually devastate the U.S. economy by engaging in an economic boycott of the United States. But, is the price of that domestically would be immense. So these are all things that I think countries have to really start to consider. And of course, as you well said, I think part of it also has to be is, when are people in the regions leadership going to figure out that if you don't actually unite, they're going to pick you off one by one. And, there are varying degrees of like, on the spectrum in terms of like the leadership. But I want to think that even center-right governments have an understanding about the need for defending, the nation, right? An actual, even if it's like a baseline understanding of what it means to confront a threat like this, of actually trying to convince other leaders, even if you're not ideologically aligned, the way that Hugo Chavez did at one point, creating SELAC, creating UNASUR, that it's necessary to have these spaces to be able to confront the bully, because he's not going to stop. And he's going to pick everybody off one by one. And then what? And then you won't have any options left. So then you see like baby steps towards this. For example, Petrobras, the Brazilian state oil company, and Pemex, the Mexican state oil company, are in negotiations about joint ventures and things like that. And I think that sort of initiative is a good first step. But I mean, it's not nearly enough. There has to be more thinking about, perhaps it's time for a regional defense pact. There is one. It's called the TIAR, TIAR. But the only time it was most recently attempted to be invoked was actually to provide for the invasion of Venezuela to oust Maduro, right? So, these instruments are out of date and they're not very useful given the conditions, and the conditions have clearly changed. And that means that I think the response has to get updated. They have to be a consideration of, an actual evaluation of the threat the United States represents to the region, the sovereignty of the countries in the region, and what it means to actually defend that. And it may mean more radical actions. It may mean, the need for a mutual defense pact. It may mean for a new regional organization, if the one that exists now. And then one thing I would add to that is that if it's not possible to create this, if you can't get all the countries together in the same room, which would be difficult when you have people like Milei and Bukele and Noboa, then you have to work with the people who are willing to do it, right? To make the alliances with the different states that are willing to do it. Because otherwise, as the letter that Maduro sent to Noroña says, they're going to pick everybody off one by one.
I think that's a good place to leave it. José Luis Granados Ceja, you'll find his work at DropSite News, and we will post, obviously, a link to the Hondurasgate piece, as I said, in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on the program. We would love to have you back to continue the conversation, because there's really a lot going on in Latin America these days. There's a lot of doings transpiring in Latin America, as The Simpsons said. So, yeah, we would love to have you back.
Yeah, it was a great conversation. Really, really happy to have talked with you. And yeah, anytime you want. And of course, for those of you who are interested in Mexico in particular, I do also want to invite people to listen to the podcast that I have with Kurt Hackbarth. He's the Mexico correspondent for Jacobin. We cover Mexico and Latin America at times, but really try to focus on Mexico. It's the only weekly English language podcast talking about Latin America. It's called Soberania. It's on YouTube. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's on Spotify. And for Spanish speakers out there, we're really lucky. We have a TV show here in Mexico called Sin Muros, Without Walls, and it's 3 anti-imperialists giving you analysis every week, every Tuesday at 11 o'clock Central Time, but it's on YouTube. You can watch it whenever you have a chance.
There you go. Check it out, folks. What are you doing? Get it out of here and check that out. Thank you again, Jose. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. Good talking to you.